Hello and welcome to Making Media Now, the Filmmakers Collaborative podcast. I'm your host, Michael Azevedo. Joining me on this episode are Will Perinello and Rick Tejeda Flores, the director and co-producers of a documentary that premiered on PBS in April called Water for Life. The film, which is available to stream via the PBS app and on pbs.org, tells the story of three extraordinary individuals in El Salvador, in Honduras, and in Chile, who refused to let government-supported industry and transnational corporations take their water and redirect it to mining, hydroelectric projects, or large-scale agriculture. Despite reassurances from companies and the authorities, they knew what lay ahead: contaminated water, environmental devastation, and the destruction of their communities. It's a story of courage and determination, betrayal and corruption, death threats and murder, and of unexpected victories in the countryside and in the courts. It's a story that asks how economic development can grow in harmony with environmental protections. Above all, Water for Life illuminates a growing recognition of Indigenous rights and a rising demand for corporate responsibility and environmental justice. It's a story that begins and ends with water. Making Media Now is sponsored by Filmmakers Collaborative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting media makers from across the creative spectrum. From providing fiscal sponsorship to presenting an array of informative and educational programs, Filmmakers Collaborative supports creatives at every step in their journey. To learn more, visit filmmakerscollab.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please do like, share, and follow. Now on to my conversation with Will Perinello and Rick Tejeda Flores. Hello and welcome to Making Media Now. We are welcoming Will Perinello, who is the director of a film called Water for Life, and Rick Tejeda Flores, who is one of the producers on the film. Water for Life is a new documentary that debuted on PBS on April the 21st, but it will be streaming on pbs.org and the PBS app until late July, so plenty of opportunity to check out this film, which follows three really extraordinary people who risk their lives to save precious water resources from political and corporate interests in Latin America. So before we dive into the film, I want to give you each an opportunity to maybe introduce yourselves and maybe talk a little bit about your work histories and how you've come to tell these particular types of stories. And Will, I'll start off with you.
Thanks for having us on, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been making documentary films for close to 40 years. I have a filmmaking partner, John Antonelli, who was not a partner on this film. He was an advisor. And John and I met making films for Video West, which was this kind of renegade news service out of the San Francisco Bay Area where we live that I was looking at unique aspects of the news from a countercultural perspective. You know, people who came out of FM radio news from the late 60s and 70s created this thing. And our first project together was making a film about no nukes in Diablo Canyon and celebrities' involvement with the issue and whether that was meaningful or superficial. And we argued that given that this was a celebrity culture in which we live, having celebrities involved with issues matters, particularly when their hearts were in the right place and when they were committed. They understood the issues. So
yeah, I remember Jackson Browne taking center stage and a lot of benefits for that.
Jackson and Bonnie Raitt and the band Orleans at that point. And I'm trying to remember. John Hall, who then became, a politician. And anyway, so that's how we began. And our first film was about Jack Kerouac, and that was a big success for us. No one had made a film about Kerouac, which was surprising to us at that time. And since then, we've made films about being Italian American, about baseball, about sumo wrestling. And but around 21 years ago, we were asked to make films for the Goldman Environmental Prize. And the Goldman Prize is a San Francisco-based foundation that every year recognizes 6 grassroots activists from around the world who have achieved a seemingly unachievable goal. We took those films, we make 5-minute films, about 6 people each year, and we turned it into a PBS program called The New Environmentalists. And we won 5 regional Emmys for that program. And doing that work led us to be around environmental defenders. And that's how I found the 3 stories in my film. And we began actually thinking we were making a film only about someone from El Salvador, Francisco Pineda. And 5 years in, we decided we needed to broaden the process. And that's when Rick Tejada Flores came into the mix.
That's a perfect segue for you to take a moment or two to introduce yourself, Rick, and maybe talk a little bit about the history of your work and how it led to this project.
Well, I must say, showing my age, but I've been in the biz for around 50 years. Started out KQED in the days when broadcasting was relatively young, and public television had just become that instead of educational TV. On a show called Newsroom, which was really the precursor of what was the McNeil Report. It started the ball rolling in terms of really good, in-depth investigative reporting. And then I went on to get involved in public broadcasting media stuff with the founding of the Minority Program Consortium. I was the first director of the Latino Consortium. Because PBS had a paucity of this information or these subject matters or reaching these audiences. And they decided the best way to do it was to put together or support organizations that had a focus on that. Did that. And then I've been an independent filmmaker from then on. Started out as an artist, so I've made cultural films on Diego Rivera and Jasper Johns. Political films about activism, a film on World War II conscientious objectors. And people would say, well, there weren't any conscientious objectors in World War II. And I say, no, there were 25,000 of them, and they drove ambulances. And so I do things I care about, certainly politics and labor and issues of, marginalized communities like Latinos. And that's really how I got to the project. It sort of fit in with exactly the kinds of issues I want to deal with in the way I want to deal with them, not romanticizing things, but telling the way they are. And the nice thing about this project, people say, well, that's sort of brown-skinned foreign people far away, so why should we care? But, you got to connect them. There is a huge connection to how we live, the corporations here that exploit them, the corrupt, there was a senator in the 60s said, well, we'll support any dictator who can afford a pair of dark glasses.
Yeah,
so, we're fighting the odds. So that's what this film is about. And winning, which is pretty remarkable, given the environments these people work at. You said life and death, and one of them was assassinated.
Yes.
So it's really high stakes stuff.
So, Will, you had mentioned that when you first started this project, you were only thinking of the one of the stories, Francisco Pineda, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, which I hope I am. Pineda from El Salvador, but eventually. Water for Life really, as I said at the top, is following these 3 individuals. So tell me about, between the 2 of you, how did you come to the realization that there was something that linked the missions and the quests of these 3 individuals, and what perhaps made them representative of a larger story or a larger trend?
Well, they're all uniquely similar and they're all uniquely different, right? Because they're all fighting against multinationals who are corrupting their own government and usurping their rights as indigenous people as well as their land and water rights. So there's the similarity, and the struggle is uniquely different. And what I saw as being important and similar was the fact that these were people who were undeterred by incredible odds. And we had a sense, the cinematographer on the project, director of photography, Vicente Franco, who is himself an Academy Award nominated filmmaker, was with me, every step of the way. And we were confident that these stories would have a positive outcome, and we wanted to follow them to a natural positive ending. And to some extent, that's why it took 12 years to make the film. To another extent, it had to do with funding and complications of the production all along the way. And so it was important for me to show stories, particularly to younger audiences, because in showing the environmental films that I've made in schools, I've seen that there's a great deal of pessimism on the part of young people with the insurmountable odds that we seem to be facing, with climate change and political challenges and so forth. And so it was important to show the similarity of grassroots political action beginning on a community level and then growing to a regional and then to a nationwide. And so the idea of saying we really do have the power in our hands if we work together as communities. And the other thing that was undeniable was this sense of impunity, the fact that there's this incredible violence perpetuated against environmental defenders, particularly in the developing world, particularly in Latin America. Figures from Global Witness that have been tracking since 2012 show that close to 2,700 people have been murdered in that time, and a majority of them are in Latin America. The last year that they have statistics was 2023, and there were 197 people killed in Latin America. So those were kind of the threads that brought it together, if I answered your question. But I'd be curious to hear what Rick has to say.
Well,
and Rick, just to put a pin in that for one second. So let's just delineate these three individuals and sort of the David and Goliath struggles that each of the three are up against. So we have Alberto in Chile, we have Berta in Honduras, and as we mentioned just a minute ago, Francisco in El Salvador. Can we encapsulate the struggles that each of them were dealing with?
Well, they're dealing with the same struggles. And one of the reasons this is really important to understand, that one of the reasons the film got expanded was that if you tell one story, people say, oh, that happened there, but could never happen anywhere else. And so the real message is it's happening everywhere, and we have a connection with it. It's happening all over the world where there are countries that don't have industrial bases, that have resources that other countries and corporations want. It's really about resources, and which is fine if a corporation comes in and mines whatever it is, as long as they give something back to the people who they took it from. Yep. And they don't do that. So that is really the underlying theme of the film, and that's and it was also, but telling that picture broadly is also pretty difficult to make come together as a film. These are three stories. Are we watching the same story again? Well, we're watching variations on a theme. Right. Each one explores a different issue, a different way of examining the problem and solving it. They solved it in different ways. So as a filmmaker, it's a really challenging kind of film. You can do a broad survey, you can do a character-driven profile. We're trying to do both. And that's tough. That's really hard. So, took a long time to raise the money, but it took a long time to figure out the storytelling strategy that would keep people going and not confuse them.
Sure. Yeah. And uniting all three of the stories is the role of rivers and water as not just a necessary resource for food and agriculture and so forth, but also a reverence for the river from a spiritual perspective. Will, what did you see as the opportunity to use the relationship between these indigenous peoples and the river as kind of a metaphor that tied the three stories together?
Yeah, well, I mean, water is life, right? That's undeniable. We all know that, but it's quite clear to our three protagonists, and they make that clear multiple times in the film. It was something that Rick and I discussed a lot. Is it important to have each of them say that in the film? Isn't that becoming overly repetitive? And inevitably, it's so much a part of their life and their belief system that it had to be mentioned by all three of them. It was undeniable. And so, spirituality is part of daily life for the people in our film. I mean, they give thanks to the river. They make offerings to the river. There are spirits in the river that protect them, that guide them. And so in order for us to understand that, right, I understand and respect the spiritual belief of the Indigenous people who I've had the pleasure and the luck to work with, but it can seem obtuse to those of us who were raised with Christianity, Judaism, and anything that isn't earth-based in terms of its spiritual practice. So it seemed really important to show the beauty of the water. And that was going to be the through line and the thread that we all discussed. And we were constantly capturing footage while we were out filming other things, whenever we had an opportunity, whenever we had downtime. And inevitably, as drones became more prolific, we went back in all three locations when we were filming other things, and when we filmed drone shots. That was kind of at the end of the entire process. But, that spirituality is also depicted through ceremony. And so we were very lucky that we were given permission to film ceremonies in in Honduras and Chile. That comes about by spending a lot of time with your protagonists and building trust and hanging out, and not necessarily always filming every moment, not always, being driven by the clock and the dollar, even though we were learning to be patient, to be respectful, to hang out, and to let the people get to know you and see that you're not just there to, as they would say, take pictures. You're here to take, and what are you giving? And so that's what we learned in the process, that part of being respectful in an Indigenous culture is to learn to give something. And giving something of yourself simply means being mindful and respectful and meditative. When we went walking up to the top of a sacred mountain in Chile with a different Mapuche leader, someone named Juan Ramon, he recommended that we meditate and think of the land and think of our own ancestors, because of the connection to ancestors is the connection back to the land, inevitably on some level. So that's my thought about that.
So the corporate interests combined with the governmental interests at play in these three stories represent the mining industry, hydroelectric power. I think is it two instances of hydroelectric power and the mining industry? Yeah. Tell me how the concerns and the sort of the traditions of these indigenous tribes in your three stories would differ from a scenario, say, in the U.S., say maybe 100 years ago, where a village or a town is going to be flooded because the surrounding towns are going to be able to make use of what will be the resulting reservoir. So, the age-old story of, well, you're going to have to lose some of these indigenous ways or some of these more folkloric ways because progress demands it. How does that scenario compare to the scenarios you're presenting?
Well, let me just jump in on that too,
and this is Rick.
There's an argument that is for progress. The question you ask is progress for who?
Sure.
That is, again, how can you help a village if you destroy it? There's nothing left to help. And 100 years ago or 200 years ago, this was a nation built of small communities who had total, we were a farming agricultural nation originally. We were not an industrial nation. So the equation differs. And so you have people saying, well, water is a resource and everyone needs resources. Well, that's true. But it's particularly valuable to communities who live on the land, central to them. And in general, that's the whole point. Is there are laws in all these countries that say the people who are there have to be consulted. That's nice as a law. It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
We had a meeting with you and told you what we're going to do. And we did it. That's, so that's how we have to sort of look back to our own history and see how how things developed. Water is a renewable resource. Well, that's true. Our community is a renewable resource? Maybe not.
Francisco Pineda from El Salvador, whose mother was Lenca, but was not raised with a sense of his indigenous background. That had been lost. There had been a massacre of indigenous people in El Salvador in the 30s surrounding a land rights movement, and the indigeneity was kind of buried by a lot of people. But nevertheless, he grew up on the land. He would say, we want to have a better life for our families, of course, right? We want better education. We'd like to have better medical care, but we're happy living on the land, sustaining ourselves. And he was speaking to the U.S. ambassador to El Salvador, and she asked why he was opposed to mining. And he said, this is a more arid country than you realize, and the water resources are precious and more compromised from industry. If you take away our water, we can't sustain ourselves. And when we come north, then, when we have no choice but to come north to feed our families, you demonize us as the other. So which would you like? What do you want? What do you want of us? And I just thought that was so well put. And I tried to get him to tell that story multiple times, but he never could quite tell it in an interview. I wish we had been there with him, but it's nevertheless impressive, and I think he got the attention of the ambassador and was able to make his point.
When you all were making your film, tell me a little bit about the engagement you had, or the degree of engagement you had with the various, governmental entities and the corporate entities that were hoping to have clear sailing for whether it be their mining interest or their hydroelectric power interest.
Let me have Rick begin by talking a little bit about El Salvador and Pacific Rim.
Yeah, well, the relationship is that I'm not a professional journalist, but this kind of story really needs to follow journalistic standards for credibility. If you don't believe it, well, you got to tell everyone's points of view. And so it was much easier to tell the people who were on the ground fighting it. The people who were causing the problems didn't want to talk in general. It was extreme. They either refused to talk, and the head of Pacific Mining, who classed himself as a 60s progressive person, refused he absolutely refused to be talked to. And part of it is, there's this sense in the media, I've run into other films, that, well, if we talk to you, you're going to distort what we say. Mm-hmm. And the reply is, we want your side of the story. The best person to tell is yourself.
Right.
We can't distort your words. If we say it, we may say it wrong. And they wouldn't buy that. And that happened in all three countries. That it was extremely hard to get anyone to talk to us. There were a few combative interviews, but mostly they presented themselves as a very reasonable person. That was their worldview was different. I'll put it that way. But the result in terms of the filmmaker is you just can't tell the story without telling that important point of view. So it was very hard.
And if I'm representing them correctly, the at least the stated perspective of the corporate entities in the film are saying, we're going to bring improved infrastructure. We're going to pour a lot of money into this village to improve standard of living, to improve education. So a couple of questions on that. Do those improvements actually take place? And do those improvements hang around once the corporate entity has achieved their economic objectives?
Yeah, well, I mean, historically, what happens is the jobs that are provided by the industry. So let's choose mining, for example, in El Salvador. If mining had come in, they stopped it. It didn't happen. It would be low-level jobs. They're really not highly skilled, highly paid jobs. And those jobs are there for the 10 years that the mine would be, exploiting the resources. And then, it's over and done. And what's left behind is the residual from the mining. And in the instance there, they were going to be using cyanide to leach the gold from the ore. And, the water table would have been compromised and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's historically, looking at other communities and other countries, the industry that comes in around mining does not bring the kind of economic boom to the people that we think of. It tends to bring economic opportunities to those in the upper classes. Rick, you've got anything to add to that thought?
Well, yeah. I mean, even suppose you had a company that was coming in and trying to give things back. They don't give them back to the community. They give them back to the government. And for better or worse, many governments in developing countries survive on corruption. So they may actually give the money back, but people will never see it. And and again, there's the history of dictatorships in Chile. The people who were fighting were punished and imprisoned and sentenced under laws from the Pinochet dictatorial regime. Mm-hmm. And the governments may have been liberal, but they used the same laws.
Right.
Yeah. And in Honduras, the irony of it is we have a crisis attorney. That's who we were given the opportunity to speak to. The company,
what a crisis attorney is.
The company,
it's a crisis for the company.
The company in question is DESA. It was a Honduran oil corporation put together. They got the concession for this hydroelectric dam. The power was primarily going to be used to power mining. They were mining concessions that were given out in the region, and DESA through their crisis attorney. So no one from the corporation would speak to us directly, and then when the going started getting hot because 9 men were accused of murdering Berta Cáceres, of conspiring to kill her. And when those men were being brought to trial, many of them were employees of this hydroelectric power company, right? So they hired a crisis attorney to represent them and to say these young men were doing good work. They were going to bring electricity. They were going to build schools. The community, we're showing images while he's saying that where you see electrical power lines. And we filmed that film in 2015. There was electrical power there. There were schools there. Now, the government overlooked those indigenous communities. There should have been a hospital, and there wasn't. The roads weren't paved, and they should be because during the rainy season, it was impenetrable. The 2-hour drive took us 12 hours. Our vehicle got stuck 7 times in the mud. And, the locals luckily come out with their ropes and helped us get out time after time. But it's just, it's a bunch of nonsense. It's a bunch of hooey, right? I mean, and the people know that. They know that they're not going to be taken care of by these corporations that are coming in.
So we've talked a little bit about the Goliaths in the film. Let's talk about the Davids and as they are personified by the 3 individuals. Maybe we can start with Alberto. And what I'm curious about with the 3 individuals is, as filmmakers, what did you see within these individuals that, if there were similarities or if each instance was particular to the person, but is there something in the heart, in the spirit, in the persona of an activist who will put so much at risk to save what they feel is so important to them? And again, maybe we can start by talking a little bit about Alberto.
So Alberto Curamil is a Mapuche chief. Mapuche are the largest indigenous group in Chile. They're the only indigenous group in the Americas, to my knowledge. Rick will correct me if I'm wrong, but they're the only indigenous group that was not conquered by the Spaniards. To some extent, it's because the Spaniards didn't think there was anything of value there, and so they left them alone. But Alberto is a very strong leader who understands the spiritual connection of his people to the land and the water. And he had grown up under the Pinochet era where his father was a leader and his father was subjugated by Pinochet. And so he just knew that he had to stand up, and he knew that he risked his life because his father was killed. His father was tortured under Pinochet and killed. But he understood that if I don't do it, who's going to do it? And it is my responsibility. And he doesn't see himself as an environmentalist. He would make quite clear, I'm a spiritual leader. I'm a chief. And I'm just protecting the earth on which I live. What was important, we thought, as storytellers, was the idea that we needed to incorporate the families and the communities into these stories, because it's easy for these figures to be these iconic heroic on a pedestal with a bullhorn, and there's much more subtlety there. And our lead protagonists on some level are that iconic figure, and they don't necessarily easily open up emotionally to share what their motivations are in a way that gave the kind of nuanced context that we thought we needed. And so it was very, very important to us to get close to the families and to include their stories, because the way you see what's at stake and the price that these people pay for standing up to defend the earth is seen through their family members.
Rick, did you want to add anything to that? Maybe
well, no, I agree with
Berta's
everything, especially about people toughening up. I mean, the classic example is Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years at Robben Island. He survived by not being open, and once you've done that for that long, you don't change. But again, I think the nice thing about these people is they're ordinary people who saw something had to be done. They weren't born leaders. They weren't doing for power, control. They say, well, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? And Alberto, who's the chieftain of that group of Mapuches, one of his aims, I think, is to inspire everyone else. Come on, let's all get together. I can't do it. You got to do it. And they become leaders because they're very effective, at inspiring their communities.
Yeah, and Berta Cáceres was incredibly charismatic leader, and she knew what her people wanted. And she'd grown up in a family where her mother was amazing. She was a doctor, which was unusual at that time for a woman in Honduras. And her mom had worked taking care of freedom fighters during the Civil War in El Salvador. They were relatively close to the border. So freedom fighters from the FMLN would come over and she would take care of them. Berta and her then boyfriend, who became her husband, would go and work as medics. So she grew up inspired by a mother who was politically active. She then became the mayor of their community and the governor of their state. So Berta had that kind of oratory power that you see in a politician, but she wasn't at all like a typical politician. She was very direct. She answered questions. She really was there for the people. She was not there for power. She was not there for money. So she was really unique from that perspective. And Francisco, I mean, he's a quiet soul. But when he sees injustice, he knows he has to stand up, and he knows he has to stand up for his neighbors. And there's this sort of familial sense that he has with many in his community. The community became split because there were people who were pro-mining because they saw opportunities. It's also a complex political situation because the Conservative Party was heavily represented in the state where he lived, even though he represents the Liberal Party politically. And that Conservative Party was the party that was subjugating people during the Civil War in the 70s and 80s in El Salvador. So there's a great deal of violence there. You really are putting yourself at risk. There's more violence there than in other parts of the country as a result of that kind of political schism. So anyway, I guess I want to kind of buttonhole it by saying they are ordinary people who do extraordinary things. It's kind of what Rick said a minute ago. And they would say, when I tell them that I think of them as my heroes, my personal heroes, they say, but you would do the same thing if you were put in this position. And I say, thank you for thinking of me that way, but I think I'm more of a coward. I think I would flee, quite frankly. I mean, you guys are heroic. You guys are brave. And so, I mean, that's what binds them all together. They all were at great risk. They all knew it, and they weren't naive about that, but they all knew they were going to rise above it in some way, shape, or form. And so it's a very interesting way to go through life. Yeah. Their families are scared. They're not.
Yeah, and kind of to drop sort of a tragic spoiler on listeners right now, but it's certainly apropos of what we're talking about right now. Berta pays the ultimate price. She predicts her own assassination by these vested interests or their associates. and it does come to pass. Were you in the process of production at the time of her assassination? And
We were.
Yeah,
We
talk to
were.
me about how that impacted the entirety of your shoot.
Yeah, I mean, because we were with her, and you see in the film, we were with her when her life was threatened, and that was a harrowing experience for her and for us. We knew that it was a possibility, but I'll be honest, like perhaps you suspend your disbelief as an independent filmmaker every time you start a new project. I think she maybe, and we suspended our disbelief. Like it's not possible that they're going to get to Berta. She was so smart, so aware, but inevitably what we learn, and we also, talk about it in the film, there were spies in her midst. So when you have people who are maybe earning $350 a year, I mean, they're subsistence farmers, they're taking care of themselves, but they have very little. It's easy to bribe people. You can offer someone $5,000, $10,000, and the corporations will find the weak link in the chain. There's a disgruntled neighbor, and it's been generations that there's been some feud between families, or there's someone that's mentally ill or has substance abuse issues. I mean, whatever. Or there's someone who can be compromised and bribed. They find a way. And that's how they got to Berta. And so when we found out about it, Vicente Franco, the cinematographer who I mentioned earlier, and I were floored. And I went into a clinical depression for a period of time, questioning the validity of the work we were doing, wondering if it mattered. And it was just hard for me to grasp. And her daughters, who she had sent out of the country to get their university education because she knew the company was going to come after her family. That's part of their tactic, right? So for their own safety, she sent them out of the country. They all came back. They took over the Indigenous rights organization that their mother ran, and they're running it now. The oldest daughter ran for and became the first Indigenous member of Congress from their state. She's now the ambassador to Cuba from Honduras. So they said, man, get a hold of yourself. You guys are really good storytellers. This is what you do. You have to tell this story. Come on. Think about what you have. And so I got off the couch and I stopped, it was literally, I'm not exaggerating. It snapped me out of my state. That state of mind. I was despondent, and that snapped me out, and we went back to work.
What an amazing story that her daughters were not paralyzed with fear, and they were actually mobilized to right a wrong, to make sure that justice was served, and justice was served.
Which was it was horrible. We weren't surprised that they killed her. What really amazed us was that they actually did something to the killers, because that frequently doesn't happen. People,
and I think what
approval, and that's
I think what might be stunning.
That was quite amazing. That was really. I was depressed when she was killed.
Yeah,
but the fact that they actually put her killers on trial was very unique.
Yeah, and I think what might be stunning to U.S. audiences, that one of her killers was a West Point graduate.
Yeah. The president
of the Americas teaches counterinsurgency and suppression.
I'm curious, kind of a broader question from each of you. What do you think these stories might have to tell to American audiences at this particular time in our country's history?
The usual phrase that you apply to horrible things in other places is, this can't happen here.
Yeah.
And what people are learning now is this can happen here. And, and so the message is, here's how you respond. You create power by all fighting together. This is a horrible story from El Salvador, and it's repeating in a different version now. They put innocent people in maximum security prison for life. So these stories aren't over. And, and I think even our protagonists really understood that process too, that it's a continuous process, that they all said, we won a battle, we haven't won the war. The war, the gold in the ground in El Salvador is still there, and people still want it. And El Salvador is letting mining start again. So, I think we can learn a lot from that and apply it to what's happening now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I think that, I think the system here wants to make us feel like we're powerless, right? And I think a lot of Americans don't vote because they think that it's meaningless. And I'll go back to the message of the film and our three protagonists. Grassroots action creates the kind of change we want to see. And I think right now, more than ever, it's important for people to take to the streets. I think that's important. I think if the administration continues to see people directly opposed to what they're doing by taking to the streets, by taking action, by reaching out to their representatives, it will have an effect, right? There's no doubt, I think, in my mind that that's what will happen. And so we've been so overwhelmed with the first 100 days of what's happening that it's understandable that we're not sure what to do and what the hell has happened to our country and where are we going. But I think we're beginning to see the turn slowly. As I said, I wanted to make the film in hopes of inspiring younger people. And I'd like to see more younger people out on the streets because the protests that I've gone to are mostly us gray hairs. I haven't seen as many young people, and maybe they're active in a way that I'm not aware of. But, that's what I know to do.
Well, the film is Water for Life, and it will be available at pbs.org and via the PBS app until late July. And I've been speaking with the director, Will Perinello, and the producer, Rick Tejada Flores. Gentlemen, thanks for your time, and thanks for this conversation.
It was a great conversation. Thank you very much.